So now that you have begun reading the first chapter of your American Government text entitled American Government and Civic Engagement, I hope that you have been taking some notes and that we can add to those notes with this lecture. So at the end of this chapter, a few things that you will be able to accomplish are to identify the basic terminology, specifically the broad concepts of politics, institutions, and government. Now, I want to make a distinction very early on, and one that I will continue to reiterate. Although we will talk about politics, this class is not solely about politics, and American government is more than politics as well. You will also learn to understand the relationship between politics and government. You will understand why we need government and the balance between order or security and liberty. You will understand the concepts of authority and legitimacy. You will be able to briefly describe the primary forms of government like totalitarianism, authoritarianism, aristocracy, theocracy, oligarchy, and democracy. You will be able to explain the difference between a direct democracy and a democratic republic or a representative democracy. You will also be able to explain the difference between the terms that feature democracy, such as the consent of the people, the concept of popular sovereignty, universal suffrage, majority rule, and limited government. You will also be able to describe the three major theories that attempt to explain U.S. democracy, specifically those theories being majoritarianism, elite theory, and pluralism. You will also understand the concepts of political culture, political socialization, and dominant culture. You will be able to describe the trade-off between order or security and liberty, and between equality and liberty. You will understand the many forms of equality, including equality under the law, equality of opportunity, economic equality, and universal equality. You will also understand the political beliefs behind the size and limits of government. You will be able to define the concept of ideology and explain the two dominant ideologies in the U.S., which are liberalism and conservatism. You will be able to view political ideology as a continuum from socialism to libertarianism. You will be able to view political ideology as a four-cornered grid distinguishing between economic liberalism and conservatism, and between cultural liberalism and conservatism. Our opening discussion centers around the two concepts of politics and government. I mentioned earlier that we will talk about politics, but the class is not about politics, and that government is more than politics. So, politics is the process of resolving conflict and deciding, as Harold Laswell explained, who gets what, when, and how. So again, politics, according to Harold Laswell, who was a famous political scientist, said that politics is really about deciding who gets what, when they get it, and by what method they receive it. Politics is the struggle over power or influence within organizations or groups that hold or withhold benefits and privileges. An institution is an important concept that we want to define as well. An institution is an ongoing organization that performs functions for society. And government is the preeminent institution within a society that resolves conflicts or allocates benefits and privileges. Government has the ultimate authority to make those decisions. Now, it's easy to say politics is very dirty and we don't really need government. But the question that I want you to start to think about is, why is government necessary? And to what extent is government necessary? Do we need big government or small government or government somewhere in the middle? So a good way to understand the need for government is to evaluate the circumstances in which government does not exist. So some examples of that might be Somalia, which has had no central government since 1991, but they've had increased and ongoing civil wars in Somalia. Now, you might think, why can't we all get along? And that's a very good idea, but my question to that would be, how do we all get along and still get what we want and contribute to improving either ourselves or those around us? So there's a constant battle between security and order and liberty and what those things mean and what they mean at different times. Societies do need order, a state of peace and security. That doesn't mean military order where you can't have any freedom, but it means that a certain amount of security, a certain amount of peace, and a certain amount of order. Maintaining order by protecting members of society from violence of foreign entities as well as criminal activities is the oldest purpose of government. So an example to think about is the Taliban had supported Al-Qaeda, which organized the terrorist attacks of 9/11. The United States and other nations intervened in Afghanistan to overthrow this Taliban regime. Unfortunately, the Taliban regime was quickly replaced by other organizations. So the new Afghan government was never really able to take complete control from the Taliban. And the people in Afghanistan had no real sense of order or security. But they've since experienced widespread violence, destruction, and corruption. Additionally, other groups like ISIS or ISIL have began to move in and assume power. So too much government is a much more common problem than too little government. In January of 2011, 47 of the world's countries were identified as, quote, not free, end quote, by a human rights organization. Instead, they were controlled by dictators or oppressive parties or military rule. Societies need protection from government abuses. Liberty is the greatest freedom of individuals that is consistent with the freedom of other individuals. So the idea is that everyone is able to make decisions, and that is what we would want for other people. Now, societies also need authority. There must be some form of right and power of the government to enforce decisions and compel obedience. It must be broadly accepted by the majority of the people. That doesn't mean that every single person accepts every single thing that a government does 100% with no questions and no disagreement. What it means is that there is a certain set of rules and laws that people should obey. And if they don't obey them, then there are consequences to that. However, if we don't like those rules and those laws, then in a free society like the United States, we have the ability to draft legislation, petition Congress, and hopefully change those laws. Because this authority is accepted, at least broadly, by the people, it gives it legitimacy. When the majority of people are willing to abide by certain rules and certain laws. There are some examples where we see dictators in places like Egypt, Tanzania, and Libya who back in 2011 actually began to lose their legitimacy and their authority, and those governments were overthrown. Now, I mentioned that one of the important things that you're going to learn in this lesson, in this unit, is the different types of government and what they mean. So, governments are defined and classified by which person or groups control the society. So, the first one that we want to talk about is a totalitarian regime. And this is where we have rule by one small group or by one dictator that controls all aspects of the society's political, social, and economic life. We also have authoritarianism, which is where we see full control over the government itself by the ruler, while the social and economic institutions exist outside of their control. We have something called an aristocracy, and this is ruled by the best. So the idea that the upper class, the best people in society, are the ones who would rule. We also have a theocracy, which is a rule by God or gods, in which the practice means that self-appointed religious leaders actually rule, and they make their decisions in their words and their understanding by the divine will of God. We have an oligarchy, which is the rule by the few. That means a few people make all decisions. And then finally, we have the concept of democracy, which is rule by the people, a requirement in much of the world if a government will ever be granted legitimacy. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about democracy and what that means. Often we think democracy means one thing, and the way that it is implemented might be a little bit different than what we think in our mind. So, in a direct democracy, all political decisions are made by the people directly rather than by elected representatives. The legislature or the government body responsible for making all of the new laws is composed of the citizens. So examples of this are ancient Greece, Switzerland, and New England. Some states offer adaptations in three specific procedures. And those specific procedures are initiatives which allow voters to propose a law or a constitutional amendment, a referendum which allows voters to approve or disapprove of a legislative or constitutional measure. And then the third is recalls, which allows voters to decide whether to remove an elected official from office. While the framers believed in government based on the concept of consent of the people, the framers were very distrustful of a pure democracy that might be prone to the lure they believed of demagogues, abuses of the rights of the minority, or to deteriorate into an instability or mob rule. So this idea with a direct democracy was that all of the people would vote and make all decisions together. And that probably sounds really great, but when we think about the ability to actually make changes and implement legislation, it would be very difficult for all Americans to come together and have a conversation about the laws that might be needed. And so the framers were afraid that the masses would be very easily swayed. And so what they wanted to do was to create this democratic republic. So the framers created this republic where sovereign power rests with the people rather than with a monarch. So the United States would never have a king or a queen or a monarchy. The republic is based on popular sovereignty, which is the idea that the authority comes from the will of the people. This means that Americans give Congress the right to rule because we elect them. And if we don't like the way they rule, we can vote them out of office. In a democratic republic, representatives elected by the people make and enforce laws and policies. In a representative democracy, the same system exists, but the monarchy remains in place in a ceremonial rule. These two terms mean essentially the same thing, which is that the government is based on elected representatives, except in a democratic republic, we cannot have a king. So an example here might be the United States and Great Britain, where you still have a monarchy, but primarily that is a ceremonial role. So the rule of the people is the foundation of all representative democracies. Universal suffrage is the right of all adults to vote for their representatives. A majority is needed to make fair decisions. Majority rule means that the greatest number of citizens in any political unit should have the power to select officials and determine policies. Now, we know that in the United States, universal suffrage doesn't come until much later in our nation's history. Initially, the primary people who did vote were property owners. They were middle class, upper class people. The poorest people didn't vote, sometimes by choice and sometimes by law. Later on, we see something called universal male suffrage, which gives voting rights in theory to all men, but individual states enacted laws that excluded men who were foreign born, African American, or Native American from voting. And we do see suffrage granted to women in the 1920s. And then in the 1960s, we see the Civil Rights Act and then the Voting Rights Act, which made it illegal to have laws that would prevent African American men, Native American men from voting. The requirements now are that you are of legal age, so you are 18 or will be 18 at the time of the election, and that you are a citizen. A limited government is one in which the governing powers are clearly restricted, either through written document or through widely shared beliefs. Without such limits, political decisions may be based on the whims or ambitions of a few individuals. A limited government in which the powers are clearly restricted, and those powers are clearly restricted either through that document or those beliefs, is called a constitutional democracy. The constitutional democracy is one that promotes the concept of limited government. The government must have the consent or the permission of the people. And that permission really comes from exercising your right to vote and electing your representatives. So, three political theories explain how the United States democracy actually works or should ideally work. Each theory highlights a different facet of the true reality. So, the concept of democracy for everyone is majoritarianism, which holds that the government does what the majority of the people want. Now, this is popular in principle, but it doesn't explain what really happens in our system, considering the fact that there is high citizen apathy and traditionally very low voter turnout. There's the concept of democracy for the few. Elite theory holds that society is ruled by a small number of people who exercise power to further their self-interest, and the larger the population has little impact on the decision-making process. Few may prefer it now, but in the early days of the democracy, it was considered appropriate by many, including Alexander Hamilton. And then finally, you have democracy for groups, which is pluralism. And this holds that politics is conflict among interest groups, and political decisions are made through bargaining and compromise. No one dominates, and most individuals have interests in more than one group. In reality, though, the poor are rarely represented. Other ongoing struggles can lead to paralysis of the political process. So, why is the system of government in the United States stable? And you might be tempted to think, well, it's really not. But when you look at many parts of the rest of the world, the United States political process is stable. One of the ways that we determine if the political process is stable is if a government can peacefully transfer power. That doesn't mean that people are happy if their candidate loses, and it doesn't mean that they're happy when their candidate is not reelected, but it means that we don't riot and engage in a civil war between those who supported candidate A and those who supported candidate B. Political culture is the patterned set of ideas, values, and thoughts about government and politics shared by the people. Political socialization is the passage of these beliefs to society's children and to new immigrants, largely by families and schools, resulting in a dominant culture in America that is based on values, customs, and language inherited from Western European civilization. I would encourage you to think about your own political socialization. Who what, where, what are the ways that your views on politics and government have been influenced? Liberty versus order. And this is a big concept, and we're going to keep coming back to this through the semester. Civil liberties are the personal freedoms, including freedom of religion and freedom of speech, that are protected for all individuals. They are found in the Bill of Rights in the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. Personal freedom and the right to privacy can often come into conflict with order and security. Some examples of this are the loss of civil liberties during wartime, cultural conflicts over abortion, and same-sex marriage. There have been many expansions of equality, the idea that all people are of equal worth. Some are more controversial than others. Equality under the law, regardless of race, religion, gender, disability, or sexual preference, is a popular value today. But this was not accepted as a norm even 50 years ago. And it's really not even accepted as a norm today in 2020 in many parts of the world. The right to treat people unequally must be limited. So it is in this sense that equality and liberty might be thought of as conflicting values. Equality of opportunity has substantial support, but the equality of economic status is more controversial. This came to play in the 1800s. As the Western world's growing wealth and governmental power became more visible, some advocated for egalitarianism, or universal equality, which is a system in which wealth is more evenly distributed. The reduction of economic inequality conflicts with the right to property and the capitalist system. Property refers to anything that is subject to ownership, and private property are the basis of capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system characterized by private ownership of wealth-creating assets, free markets, and freedom of contract. This means that if you want to purchase something, a new car, a new television, a new iPhone, any new piece of technology, if you have the money to do that, you can do that without anyone or any government telling you you can't. The constant theme or conversation in American politics has really centered around opposition to big government. Big government in times of crisis like the Great Depression, the Second World War, the First World War, the most recent recession in the United States back in 2008, has led Americans to often feel more positive about big government when things are bad. After 9/11 was another time. When things are not good in terms of economy, most Americans tend to say the government should regulate and distribute. But when things are going well, like when you win the lottery or your job is paying very well, interest rates are low, people tend to say, oh, the government should stay out of things. The massive financial crisis of 2007 peaked in 2008 with the Lehman Brothers collapse and the abrupt halt to lending and borrowing. A bank bailout, which was passed in October, and relief was given to auto manufacturers in December. After Barack Obama took office in January of 2009, policy to a policy to counter the recession included an emergency stimulus bill, record-breaking federal budgets, and a government takeover of General Motors and Chrysler. The administration's largest initiative provided health care to the nation with the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, often called Obamacare. Those are all examples of the government increasing in its size and power. Despite the measures, high unemployment rates and the general distrust of big government set off a wave of conservative organizing which began back in 2009 in what was called the Tea Party movement. Independent voters turned away from Democrats at the polls in 2010, and Republicans were able to regain control of the House. This made it very difficult and ultimately impossible for Democrats to pass any legislation. By 2011, vigorous government action was really diminished. Political ideology is a closely linked set of beliefs about politics, with specific guiding values at its core. Anyone with political beliefs, not only those with extreme views, is said to have a political ideology. Most people have ideologies that span different ends of the spectrum depending on the situation. Very few people are extreme conservatives or extreme liberals. The two ideologies that we see most represented in the United States are conservatism and liberalism. Those who favor conservatism place a high value on order, patriotism, security in the United States. The value of liberty, when it is defined as freedom from government interference in business and a form of government support for non-traditional social interventions. Conservatives tend to place significant value on family, the ability to engage in free enterprise, and tend to dominate the Republican Party. Those who favor liberalism tend to place high value on social and economic equality. They favor heavy government regulation of the economy to benefit the most individuals. They also value liberty, but view liberty as the freedom to live life according to their own individual values. They tend to dominate the Democratic Party. Political beliefs can be viewed as a continuum from left to right or right to left. On the far left side is socialism. This is a political ideology based on strong support for economic and social equality. Socialists support the concept of government-run business and employee cooperatives. Socialists would advocate that all businesses and organizations be owned by the government and the government set pay based on equality and not work product. On the far right, we see the concept of libertarianism. This is a political ideology based on skepticism or or opposition toward most government activities. They believe in laissez-faire capitalism or the government staying out of business and letting the market regulate itself. Libertarians tend to believe that individuals should be able to live independent of the government and with as much freedom as possible. The complexities of today's political ideologies indicate that the traditional left to right spectrum cannot accurately depict the nation's wide range of beliefs about government and economic and social issues. Typically, we see that people, depending on the individual issue, may have different views and different values. They may be very conservative on one issue and very liberal on another, or vice versa. For example, someone might believe that same-sex marriage is okay and should be allowed, but that the government should not allow individuals to choose to use illicit drugs. There is generally no accepted label for groups. We have people who would say they are economic liberals but social or cultural conservatives. Some have suggested that they might be populists, but that's a very misleading term because it refers to hostility toward political, economic, and cultural elites. The individuals who consider themselves to be economic liberals and cultural or social conservatives do support government action to promote economic equality and fairness to defend traditional social values. Libertarians are individuals that believe in the most complete freedom possible in both economic and social matters, and often support the Republican Party as well as the Libertarian Party. The liberal label, again, labels are something that may make us feel anxious. They may make us feel concerned, but liberals are usually those who object to the negative connotations held by labels. More people are willing to call themselves conservative, often implying that they are moderate, rather than being willing to say that they are liberal, which is often assumed to be radical. To think about those terms, socialism, liberalism, conservatism, libertarianism, in terms of the political spectrum, this table will help you to think about those terms in how much government should exercise power over the economy and what the government should do or provide. So again, socialists would believe in active government control over all major economic sectors. So anything that generates the economy, so businesses, organizations, schools, and so on. And they would advocate for economic equality for everybody. So they would advocate that everyone be made equal and no one be able to have more money or work harder and earn more money or purchase anything without direct consent from the government. Liberalism views the government as a positive agent that can do good and believes that government should provide economic security, equal opportunity, and social liberty. Conservatism has a positive view of the government as well and believes that the government should support capitalism, which is the free enterprise and free economy. They believe that the government should provide economic liberty, social order, and morality. And then libertarianism. Libertarians believe in almost no regulation of the economy. They also believe in total economic and social liberty. Libertarians can often be in conflict with both liberals and conservatives. So, problems with the traditional political spectrum. Libertarians oppose government action to promote traditional moral values, though groups on the political right do tend to favor that. Liberals appear to support big government, but conservatives also support big government when it comes to certain social issues. So there are no cookie cutter views and values when we think about what different political ideologies support. It's often very relative depending on the moment and the issue. Here we can see the grid that I mentioned that you'll want to be able to identify. We see the concept here of economic liberty, so that's keeping the government completely out of the economy, and economic equality, which is increasing the amount of involvement that the government has in the economy. We also have this kind of push and pull between cultural order and cultural liberty. The idea that there should be a certain set of standards that as a society people follow. One of those might be we don't go out in public nude, or we don't go out in public and be intoxicated, those kinds of things. In a society with complete cultural liberty, you might be free to do anything that I just mentioned. Be sure that you're taking notes, be sure that you have read the chapter, and go ahead and get that quiz done. Have a great day.